Hello everyone, I'm Mark, I call this The Modern Age, and today I'm going to talk to you about a big fat hit piece that was put out by The Australian. So, I have it right here. Well, this is just one page, the rest of it's down here. I don't know if anyone watched the QandA on Monday, but there was a controversy over a questioner who brought up bill leaks and the idea of freedom of speech. And there was some protesting that went down. So, basically what happened was there was some protesters who called Bill Leaks a racist for his cartoons. The moderator said, "We appreciate your concern, but nobody can hear you, so it's time to leave." You couldn't really hear them very well, and they were ushered out. The whole thing took about 20 seconds. Nobody on the panel referenced it, and everyone went on about their day. But that incident was good enough for The Australian to put a front page story, a second page story, both with pictures, and a second page story, all with pretty nasty headlines about them. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about liberal bias in the media, about publicly funded broadcasting, democracy, and I guess we'll talk a little bit about identity politics, because this is pretty important, because I think identity politics is really degrading political debate in Australia and all over the world, and I think the media plays a really big part of this. And importantly as well, it really divides the population, and it really divides the people, and I spend... I started making this channel because I've started to become disillusioned with mainstream media and mainstream political commentary. The Overton window wasn't big enough for me, so the acceptable political discourse wasn't really big enough for me, and I wasn't getting political opinions on television that sort of represent my views, and I think I have pretty reasonable views. And not only that, I tend to get into a lot of debates on the internet, in person, pretty much everywhere. I love to talk politics, I love to learn new information, and I find that whenever I get into a debate, at least 50% of it is spent just untangling the weeds of identity politics, of people saying, "Oh, you lefties, you're all the same, you believe this, you believe that, you're such a hypocrite, you believe in this, but you don't believe in that," and I have to be like, no, that's not my position. This isn't what all lefties believe. This isn't what some lefties believe. And just because somebody believes this doesn't mean everybody believes that. And it happens on the right as well. It happens on the left. The left do the exact same thing about the right. And I've gotten into debates. I got into one recently about Milo Yiannopoulos, in which some leftists were celebrating his... And don't get me wrong, I fall under the banner of leftists, but they were celebrating his losing his job and the controversy surrounding him, and they called him a pedophile. And, I mean, first of all, if you're going to slander somebody, I mean, slandering someone as a pedophile is probably as vile a thing as you can do. And in this case, there's a lot of controversy surrounding pedophilia, but this is a very complex subject, and as far as I'm aware, there's no evidence at all that he was a pedophile, just that he had very controversial opinions regarding that subject. And worst of all, it gets in the way of the debate. And so, if this person ever gets into a debate, if that becomes the narrative, that the left just call him a pedophile, you support pedophiles, blah blah blah. And I'm sorry to bring up that subject, but nobody's really discussing the topics. They're just sort of yelling at each other and yelling at each other's perceived beliefs that they think the other person holds. So, let's get on to the perceived liberal bias in the ABC. And there's this locomotion of there's a chorus of people who want it to lose funding, who want it to be defunded. There's a whole lot of people who are ideologically opposed to public broadcasting. And why is that? Why are they opposed to that? Because they believe that public broadcasting, if it's paid for by the government, will just become an extension of the government. It'll become an arm of the government and just be state-run propaganda. So, let's talk about specifically the ABC and this phenomenon that the ABC is considered to have liberal bias. I personally, sometimes I see it, and sometimes I don't. Mostly, I think the ABC does a really good job of trying to be unbiased, trying to be objective, and I see that in Q&A, and they've implemented these policies, like they tell you what percentage of the audience supports which party. They almost always have people representing different views. Tony Jones, I think, does an admirable job of remaining neutral most of the time and grilling people on both sides. So why do people keep calling ABC biased? Well, one explanation is it's biased towards liberals, and I don't see it because I'm a liberal, and I just think all the newspapers are biased. That's entirely possible. But it's probably more likely it's a mix of a few things, such as confirmation bias. So if you have more conservative views, let's use that as an example, and you perceive the ABC as having a liberal bias, then whenever you hear them having a liberal bias, or whenever you hear somebody articulating a liberal opinion, it's just going to be reinforced in your mind, and you're going to pay more attention to that than when your opinion is being reinforced, and it just slides right in. Forgive the innuendo. That will be especially pervasive when mainstream media is constantly calling the ABC bias. And let's just stop and think for a second. If there is any person, institution in the world that has a vested interest in delegitimizing public broadcasting, it's corporate media, right? So that doesn't necessarily negate any argument they make, but it does give them a damn good reason for why they would constantly be trying to delegitimize something such as the ABC. So let's say sometimes there is a liberal bias, or every now and then there's an episode of Q&A, like on this Monday, when pretty much everyone is a liberal, small L liberal, and you're reading in the newspaper how biased this thing is. You're going to notice far more often that you're going to think there is a liberal bias. The conservative government will always be talking about it. Especially conservative governments, because, well, I don't know, I guess Labour in power, I mean, nobody likes to be criticised, but Tony Abbott particularly came under fire, so they're going to be calling it a liberal bias. And these things will constantly be reinforcing these other biases, where some institutions will say, oh, that's a liberal institution, and then the liberal institution will say that's a conservative institution, and it turns into this identity politics team mode. There's another option as well, in that liberal values, in my opinion, they're good at promoting free speech, free public and open debate in general. Hear me out there. So many people are going to groan and say, no, liberals, they just want censorship and all these kinds of things. I just mean the value of encouraging debate and letting people have their say, and that was evinced in this episode, in the thing we're going to talk about, in which the protesters weren't shouted down. They were quickly removed because it was inappropriate, but it wasn't as though everyone was pre-vetted and there was only going to be a certain topic for discussion. This is a very open debate environment. Questions from the audience responds, people from different sides, things are flying, it's all impromptu. So that's, in my view, a very open debate environment. Now, that's not necessarily the case. These are just possible explanations I'm giving. So the other possible explanation I would give is that public funding of institutions in general ought to give better representations of the people, and I think in general people are less conservative than what large corporations want everyone to believe. So that's kind of my opinion. If you disagree with that, I'm all ears. Write it down below. I do read the comments. That's how I see it, but then again, I lean to the left, so I might be a little bit biased in how I approach these things. But as somebody who does obviously sit on the left end of the spectrum, and as an avid reader of Noam Chomsky, and I'm a big fan, what I'm more worried about is corporate media and corporate propaganda, and of mainstream media becoming a tool of propaganda for the government. So there's this fear that it's the public broadcaster is going to be become a propaganda arm of the government. But then how come when conservatives are in power, it's still liberal media? If it's propaganda for the government, wouldn't it become more conservative when the conservative government is in power? So that makes no sense from the start. Whereas corporate media will always have a bias towards money and towards power, towards advertising, towards selling their product, readership, to their advertisers and to the people with power and to people with big vested interests. So is there anybody in the world, I'd love to hear it if you write a comment down below, who really thinks the Murdoch-owned media is unbiased? I don't think that's the case. I think it's more the case that people think, well, this is the right perspective, the conservative perspective, and that's the liberal perspective. Whereas what I see is there are institutions with a liberal perspective, and there's institutions with a right-wing perspective, and I see institutions like the ABC, whether it leans one way or the other, as at least striving or trying to uphold some form of objectivity and unbiasedness. So that's how I see it. I really respect the ABC, and I think it's crucial for a democracy that there needs to be a publicly funded broadcaster for news, so that there aren't... Look at the corporate ownership of media in Australia. What is it? I should have fact-checked this. Something like 70% of all media is owned by Rupert Murdoch, or is it 70% owned by two companies? It's either 70% owned by one or two companies of distributed media. Something like that. And that's crazy that one person can set an agenda for an entire organization. And I'm not saying that things like The Australian don't do good work, but we all know that there's, certain biases in places, in institutions. So, or at least I hope we all know that. And the other thing is the ABC such an inexplicable institution that it doesn't matter who's in power, that no regulations can possibly be written to turn it from a liberal institution to a more neutral institution, or to a conservative institution? Why has it inexplicably been a liberal institution for so long, and it doesn't matter how they try to improve it? It doesn't make sense to me. It feels like it's part of a narrative of us versus them, left versus right, that I really think it's just degrading. It's degrading public debate, and it's degrading political action and discourse, and it just divides us. So that's what I've said about that. Now let's move on to the hit piece in The Australian. So there were two articles written in The Australian today, and one of them is by Chris Kelly, I believe. That's the one I'm going to be talking about. The other one was slightly more objective. It was still framed in a way. All three headlines were very negative towards the ABC, and is sitting underneath that 18C freedom of speech article as well. But it's the second article by Chris Kelly, which was the real hit piece. There's no response from ABC in this article. It's right next to the other article, and it feeds into this narrative. So it's repeatedly saying the people who fund the ABC. It's these jabs at not everyone who watches it, but everyone is a funder of it, and we're all the worse off for it. Subtle dig saying we should defund it, but he makes some really bizarre claims, and some of them I think are truly hypocritical, and they just seem blind, I think. So I'm going to bring up some quotes. So these are direct quotes taken from the article. I probably should have scanned them. Maybe I'll do that next time so that they look more believable, so nobody thinks I'm making these up or lying, but they're the real quotes. Anyone who bought the paper can attest to that. So, first of all, they suggest that the ABC planted these protesters in the audience. I've got to fix that. So they're saying the ABC not only are they left-wing, they're very cynically left-wing, and the ABC just wanted to call Bill Leaks a racist, and they set up this panel of lefties. They set up this leftist activist host replacing Tony Jones. They've put these people into the audience just knowing that they're going to interrupt in a most inappropriate way. So he suggested this without any evidence. I mean, I believe QandA has to approve people who go in, and so they're saying they would have got the background of these protesters, and these people did have a background of activism, but this is a pretty far-fetched claim. It's very cynical. Let's go on to this quote. Yet the thing about free speech, public broadcasting, and national discourse, decency matters. So what he's also done here is accused ABC, the liberal media, of political incorrectness. So, let me repeat that. Accusing the ABC of political incorrectness. The author of The Australian, owned by Rupert Murdoch, which is constantly lobbying for the repeal or the rewriting of the Racial Discrimination Act so as to remove the idea of being offensive being illegal, has accused the ABC, the liberal media, of being politically incorrect. So, I mean, you would think that would be something that they would champion. That this is here we have a media that isn't afraid of causing offense. But this guy is very offended. He was triggered hugely by this thing. If this is not a cynical ploy, this guy is well triggered. And one of the things he's upset about is their lack of political correctness. So there's some real irony there. But the ABC's preferred sensationalism and outrage of its social media-driven agenda. So he has also accused them of relying on sensationalism, of really sexing up their stories and making it nasty and blowing things out of proportion and giving some stories way more attention than they really deserve. The Australian, the author of The Australian, has accused the ABC of being too sexy. So I don't mean sexy in a glamorous way, I mean of outrageous sensationalism kind of way. That's a bold claim. I think it kind of speaks for itself. Here's a really strange argument. And anyone interested in the free exchange of ideas on the public broadcaster would have understood this was precisely the moment for the host to condemn that intervention and those sentiments and to apologize immediately. So, in context, what he's talking about here is saying this is the time when you don't allow these people to speak. So, the person in the Australian... Okay, hear me out again. The author of this article, the writer of this article in The Australian today, was saying that in the name of free speech, remember, it's right underneath this article, MPs lobby for 18C showdown, in the name of free speech, they shouldn't have allowed this intervention to happen, and when the intervention happened, they should have shut them down from talking. So, in the name of free speech, the ABC shouldn't have allowed them to speak freely. Oh. The other point is, and this is the point that has, I suppose, a little bit of traction. He's pointing out here. So this is the part of this argument that does make a little bit of sense. He's calling them hypocritical. Oh, if it was somebody who was protesting Sharia law, they would have apologized, definitely. So, there's another point in the article. Oh, I should have gotten a quote for this one, because this ties into this point. There's another point in the article. Let me read it for you. Where he talks about how the host, Tom Ballard, the sit-in host for Tony Jones, at the start of the segment, when the person asked the question about Bill Leaks, the moderator he stood up and he voluntarily said, "Just so everybody knows watching, I was involved in signing a petition that was condemning these cartoons by Bill Leaks," the cartoons he was talking about. So, in the article, he condemns the ABC for putting on a leftist activist who was obviously going to be slanted against Bill Leaks. But what he was doing in that moment was being very responsible. He's saying, these are my views, and so anything I say about this subject, you need to be aware that I have this potential bias. So, when these people stood up and this article criticized the ABC heavily for this moderator's behavior here. These people stood up and started screaming, Bill is a racist. Spoiler alert, you couldn't even hear what they said. If it wasn't in the context, you never would have figured it out. These people stood up, and he said, we appreciate that you're concerned. We understand that you're very passionate about this subject. La-di-da, but nobody can hear you, and you're disrupting things, so you have to leave now. I'm sorry, nobody can hear you. And he was very cordial about it. So he condemned the ABC for this person's attitude of the word he used was groveling to the activists. So when really it's just somebody who he himself appreciates the importance of activism, and he let everyone know when he said that he signed this activist form that he is an activist, that he thinks activism is important. So when he says, I appreciate that you think this is important, etc., etc., that is his bias. That is the bias that he responsibly referred to and voluntarily obliged the audience with that information. So he ignored the journalistic responsibility that, he did a great job in acknowledging potential conflicts of interest or whatever. And he ignored that and just condemned the ABC. Hypocrites, even though it was, I think, pretty responsible journalism. And the rest of the panel, this was an episode about arts, so they were much more left-wing in general. And everyone else was, I think, very respectful towards Bill Leaks as a person, while everyone was opposed to his cartoons. I think it was unanimous that everyone was opposed to his cartoons. And nobody else was disrespectful in the same way that the activists were towards the recently deceased. Nobody out and out called him a racist. And yeah, it's just a really strange and very, very slanted article. So that's why I wanted to give my point of view. Final quote, this is how the article ends. Little wonder public debate has become so degraded in this country. So that's his final conclusion of his entire article, all 537 words of it. You know what I saw when I watched that episode, and I'll post a link to the episode down below. I saw a nuanced debate. Didn't really represent the pro-free speech side of it, or the pro... I'm not sure what term to use there, but the people who were defending Bill Leaks didn't think they were offensive, thought he was being provocative to get people to talk about a very important issue. Those people weren't really on the panel, and I honestly think that's an oversight by the ABC. But he didn't write one word about that in this article. That's a genuine criticism of this episode, and I put that out as somebody from the left. I felt like I was getting a nuanced position. And it wasn't that exciting to watch because it was too nuanced, but everybody was in agreement with each other. I didn't feel like I learned anything new. I didn't feel like there was conflict. There was no sensationalism except for, you can't even hear it. You couldn't even hear them. It was done in 20 seconds. And he's written a whole article. And he didn't have a real legitimate criticism like I just did just then. So, who's the real institution that is degrading public debate in this country? That's what I ask you. And I'm going to give you a hint. I know it's backwards, but it's the mainstream media. So please, if you watch this video, I encourage you to like it. I encourage you to subscribe. I'm going to be putting a lot of effort into this channel. It's just something I'm new to, so I'm learning everything. That's why it's all pretty low production value. But I'm going to be putting out videos regularly. Going to be dealing with more topical stuff. I have a Twitter now. You should be able to find the link. Yeah. So any encouragement, feel free to share it. And I'm going to hopefully be building it up. And I'm going to be trying to be putting more people on, people with different points of view to me. I'm going to be trying to make it conversational, work with some partners, and I want there to be non-corporate, non-state sanction or state-funded alternative media sources that promote discussion and promote debate and promote different points of view that aren't really that unreasonable. So it helps get across modern Australia's point of view, because I find when I debate people, I can generally get to a good middle ground. We can compromise and we can talk about real solutions to things. So I encourage everyone, write a comment down below if you disagree with me, if you agree with me, if you have any advice on the videos. Hit me up on Twitter. So I've seen have asked me questions in comments in previous videos. I really want to start engaging with people and talking to them. I'd love to reply. I'd love to make video replies, but Twitter might be a way that we can really do that. So I'm going to get active on Twitter. And otherwise, support alternative media in any way that you can. I just wish that, somebody, going back to this topic of corporate media, I just wish there was somebody out there who, I already gave away the spoiler, who really talked about the damage that mainstream media can do and the importance of public broadcasters.